Street puppy gets trapped under rubble after a slide, and he closes his eyes thinking it was the end of him. But then a miracle happened. Have you ever what it would be like to face the world without anyone to take care of you? No warm hugs on cold days, no words of comfort when fear your chest, not even a look that says you're safe now. For Billy, a little puppy with a sweet look and a soul-marked abandonment, this was not a hypothetical question. It was the harsh reality he faced every day, the deserted streets of a city that seemed too big for such a small and fragile heart. It was a grey afternoon, one of those in which the sky seems to the emptiness of someone who has already lost too much. The rain fell thinly, but relentlessly, turning the dust into small puddles of mud. The cold wind cut through the air, bringing a smell of wet earth mixed with that of trash accumulated on forgotten sidewalks. In the middle of that dark scene, there was Billy, with his entangled fur, stuck to his thin body that barely hid his protruding ribs. His small paws were soaked, and each step seemed to weigh more than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to trap him, sinking him into the mud, just as abandonment had tried sink his hope. Billy walked aimlessly, guided only by the instinct of surviving another day. An empty stomach hurt. And that was not just physical, but also emotional. It was the hunger for food, but also for affection, for a gentle look, for a touch that wasn't harsh indifferent. He sniffed the air, hoping to find something, anything that could ease the dull ache. The smell of food to come from everywhere. But when he approached the torn garbage bags, what he found was spoiled remains, dry bones and soggy of cardboard, which did not satisfy either his hunger or his despair. People hurried past, protected by their colorful umbrellas, contrasted with Billy's grey world. He watched them with big, wet eyes, perhaps expecting a look of compassion, gesture of kindness. But all he received were hurried footsteps, averted glances, and in some cases, even harsh words to push him away. Nobody really Billy. For them, he was just another street dog, invisible amid the city's frenetic routine. But if you looked closely, you would see more than a hungry cub. I would see a story of loss, of struggle, and above all, an unbreakable will to survive. The cold of the night to intensify. Billy huddled in a corner between two dumpsters, trying to protect himself from the icy wind that seemed to pierce thin skin. He lay down on the hard, wet floor, shivering not just from the cold, but fear. The fear that this would be another difficult night, or perhaps his last. The world seemed too big, too cruel for such a small being. But so, there was something about Billy that refused to give up. A thin thread of hope hidden somewhere inside him that kept him breathing. Even everything seemed lost. As he tried to sleep, curled up and vulnerable, flashes of memories invaded his mind. Images of better times, of warmth, security, or the closest thing to that he has ever known. It was as if his mind wanted to hold on to something good, even if distant. To that, not everything had been darkness. But these memories, as fragile as he was, soon dissipated with the sound of rain hitting the asphalt. Billy back to the unforgiving present. Time passed slowly, and every minute seemed like an eternity. Billy's stomach growled in protest, but he was used to that feeling. What hurt most was the emptiness that hunger couldn't explain. The emptiness of not having a home, a family, someone say, "You matter," the kind of pain that no food in the world can cure. And while the city remained indifferent, Billy resisted, because even the world turns its back. There is something inside us, or a little puppy, that refuses to completely go away. Deep down, maybe he was waiting something he didn't even know how to define. It wasn't just food. It was a miracle, a kind gesture in a sea of indifference. Faye, that really saw him. But on that cold, lonely night, all Billy had was himself, and sometimes that was all it took to keep trying. What Billy didn't know was that his story was far from over. And even if he couldn't imagine it, destiny was already in motion, preparing encounters, twists that would change his life forever. Because sometimes, when all seems lost, that's exactly when something extraordinary is to happen. Do you believe that even the smallest of hearts can carry a great story? Comment on the hope if Billy touched your heart, and subscribe to the channel to see what comes next. Oh, and leave your like to support these stories so that more people see that animals deserve someone to care for them and care for them. Have you ever a cold that is not just on the outside but that seems to reach your heart? That kind of cold that can't be resolved with a blanket. It comes from loneliness, fear, and the absence of a safe place. For Billy, that little puppy with sweet eyes and a tired soul, the cold of the night just a question of temperature. It was a reflection of a world that seemed to have forgotten he existed. Night had fallen as if the sun was in a hurry to disappear, leaving Billy in the darkness. The streets were empty. The distant sound of one car or echoed between silent buildings, while the cold wind slipped through the corners. whistling as if mocking thee of that small being. The ground was damp from the rain that had fallen earlier, creating small puddles that reflected the light from the streetlights. Billy walked slowly, his tiny paws soaked, each step more difficult than he was shaking, not only from the cold, but from the exhaustion of someone carrying a burden too big for someone. So trying to find some refuge, Billy spotted an abandoned car, rusty and in dirt, leaning against a poorly lit sidewalk. To many it was just a forgotten piece of metal, but to Billy it looked like a palace. He there, huddling under the truck bed, trying to protect himself from the biting wind that seemed to cut through his thin skin. The ground was cold hard, but at least it offered some barrier against the wind that seemed to want to strip away what little heat he had left in his. Billy lay down, trying to keep warm, but it was impossible to escape the cold feeling that seemed to spread inside and out. His stomach growled loudly, a cruel that it had been days since his last decent meal, if garbage could be called that. The emptiness in his belly hurt as much as the loneliness followed him like a shadow. With a dry, scratchy tongue, he tried to lick up a few drops of water running down from the nearby gutter. The bitter taste was not satiating, but at least it wet the parched, an illusion of relief that lasted only a few seconds. Little Billy looked at the world around him with eyes that held more sadness than they should have. He saw the lights of houses in the distance, windows that held warm homes and people gathered together, laughing, eating, living. The contrast with his own reality was painful. How could such a being feel so much? The cold wasn't just physical. It was the cold of absence, of the lack of a gentle touch, of someone who cared. Dawn progressed. The cold seemed more merciless. Every gust of wind made Billy's small body contract in involuntary spasms. He tried to curl up even more, as if he could disappear into the dark and hopefully wake up in a different place, where the ground wasn't so hard and life wasn't so. But sleep came in short fragments, interrupted by the cold that made him wake up from time to time, his body rigid and his heart racing with fear. The fear, this was his constant companion. The fear of what was out there and what could hide in the fear of hunger that seemed to grow every minute, like an invisible monster devouring the fear that no one would ever find him, that no one would ever care, because true despair is not being. It's feeling that even surrounded by a world full of people, you remain invisible. In a moment of weakness, Billy out a low moan, a sound that was almost imperceptible but carried the weight of his pain. It was a cry for help, not to anyone specific, but to universe, to chance, to anything that could hear it. Because sometimes, even without understanding the meaning of words, the heart knows how to for help. And Billy's heart, though small and bruised, still beat with a silent hope, hidden beneath layers of pain, and he closed his eyes for a moment, letting his mind wander into fragmented memories, flashes of a time when the cold so intense and hunger wasn't constant, a time when there was the warmth of another body at your side, the comfort of a tongue cleaning your dirty forehead, the soft sound of familiar breathing. But these memories came and went quickly, as if time wanted to erase them, leaving him stuck only in the cruel present. What kept Billy fighting? Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something, an invisible thread that connects even the most hurt hearts to the possibility of a better tomorrow. He didn't know what the held, but something inside him, however tiny, refused to give up. Even when everything seemed lost, even when the cold was and the hunger felt like a black hole inside him, there was a spark, small but alive. The dawn advanced slowly, each minute by as if time was mocking your resistance. Billy was still there, curled up under the abandoned car, fighting the sleep that seemed more than the cold itself, because he instinctively knew that closing his eyes for too long could mean not opening them, and he wasn't ready to give up yet. As the sky began to lighten, staining the horizon with pale shades of gray and blue, Billy breathed hard, but he breathed. The cold was still there. Hunger still hurt and the fear still lingered, but he had survived the night. And sometimes surviving is a silent act of courage, a protest against abandonment and indifference of the world. Have you ever wondered how a simple memory can warm the heart, even when everything is cold? No matter how difficult the present is or how unforgiving the world seems, memories have the power to take us back to when we felt safe, loved. For Billy, a little puppy lost in the solitude of the streets, it was these that, although painful, kept the fragile flame of hope alive. The dawn was dark. The bitter wind whistled between the abandoned and the cold, seemed to seep into Billy's bones. Huddled under a rusty car, the hard, icy ground offered comfort. His empty stomach growled in protest, but hunger was already an old acquaintance. What hurt most was not the lack of food, the absence of something he couldn't even name. A home, a touch, a "you're safe now." His tired eyes closed for a moment, not because he was relaxed, because the tiredness was greater than the fear. It was at that moment that memories began to emerge, as if the cold had opened the door to memory. Suddenly he was no longer alone under the car. He was next to her. Officer, her scent still lived somewhere in Billy's mind, soft and familiar. A mix of earth warmth and something only he would recognize, love. She wasn't just his mother, it was his whole world. The first image that came was of simple place, perhaps a corner under a marquee, where the cold concrete seemed less cruel because Luna was there. He, the warmth of her body, the way she wrapped her body around him, protecting him from the wind. Her chest rose and fell in a calming rhythm, as if say, "It's okay, I'm here." Billy saw himself as a puppy again, tiny and fragile, with his eyes still half closed, instinctively seeking his warmth. The world was a big, scary place, but as long as he was cuddled up next to Luna, nothing else mattered. She gently his head, a simple gesture, but one that meant everything to him. The sound of her breathing was a lullaby that made him forget about the cold and even fear. Luna was strong. Even though she was a street dog, with that told stories that Billy would never know, she had a sweetness that only mothers know how to have. He remembered her rummaging through trash for something to eat, always bringing what little she found to him first, before thinking about herself. Were days when she came back with almost nothing, but still she made it seem like enough. The look in her eyes when she looked at Billy was a look said, "You are my everything." But memories don't always just bring comfort. Some come with the pain of a void that will never be filled. For Billy, the weight of Luna's memory carried this duality. The flashback deepened and Billy relived the day everything changed. It was an afternoon, so many others, but there was something in the air, a feeling he didn't understand at the time. The sun was low, dyeing the sky in gold, while Luna walked ahead, her gaze attentive and determined. They were hungry more than usual. Luna seemed restless, driven a fierce instinct to find something to feed the little cub that stumbled behind her, confident that her mother would always find a way. They at a busy avenue. The noise of the cars was deafening to Billy's sensitive ears, but Luna didn't hesitate. Across the street, a piece of stale caught his eye. Maybe it was little, but for someone who is hungry, a piece of bread can seem like a feast. She looked at Billy for a moment, that look that said, "Wait here," and walked through. Billy stayed where he was, obediently, but his eyes never left Mother. Luna ran between the cars, agile, dodging with the skill of someone who had done this before. But sometimes a second all fate needs to change a life. The sound came before the image, the bang of the brakes, the scream of the driver, the dry of the impact. Luna didn't have time to dodge. The truck hit her squarely. Billy's world stopped in that instant. He didn't understand what happened right away. For a puppy, the concept of forever still doesn't make sense. All he knew was that his mother was on ground, motionless on the other side of the street. The forgotten piece of bread beside her seemed a cruel of the fight she was waging to keep him alive. Billy ran to her, crossing the street clumsily. By the drivers who were already on their way, too hurried to notice a small broken heart. He came to her side and lay down next to her, pushing his against his mother's body, trying to wake her up, hoping to feel that familiar warmth again. But Luna didn't move. Time passed strangely that moment. There was no noise of cars, no screams, nor the cold of the asphalt. There was only silence and emptiness. The last Billy had of his mother was unlike any other. There was no movement, no silent promises that everything would be okay, just the absence. When returned to the present, huddled under the abandoned car, a tear slipped from his tired eyes. The cold seemed more intense, the loneliness. But at the same time, there was something about those memories that kept him breathing. Maybe it was Luna's unconditional love, which still alive inside him, even though she was no longer there. Have you ever stopped to think about how life can change in the blink of an eye? Moment, everything is calm, or at least bearable. And in the next moment, the world seems to fall apart, leaving behind only fear, emptiness, and for Billy, the little puppy with the sweet eyes and wounded soul, time seemed to be divided between before and after. That moment in the world literally began to collapse around him. The chill of dawn stilled Billy's fragile body when he was ripped from his memories. The sound was the first warning. Not the soft sound of rain that'd been falling for hours, but a deep rumble, a muffled roar that seemed to come from the ground itself. His eyes shot wide with confusion and fear. His heart started beating faster before he even understood why. The small space under the abandoned car he had chosen as a refuge began to vibrate slightly. Within seconds, the gentle tremor turned into a violent jolt. The ground was alive and furious. Tried to get up, but panic left him paralyzed for a moment. The survival instinct, however, spoke louder. He crawled out of hiding, his little paws on the wet asphalt. The air was heavy, laden with dust and humidity, while the sky poured heavy rain, as if it wanted to wash the world at once. The water, mixed with the soaked earth, formed a thick mud that began to move strangely, almost as if it alive. The deafening sound grew closer. It was the sound of the earth giving way, of rocks rolling, of concrete breaking apart a landslide. The hill above the street where Billy was sheltering was crumbling, and the mud was advancing with a fury he never have imagined. There was no time to understand. Just run. With his heart racing, Billy ran. Their paws sank into the rapidly accumulating mud, making every step a battle. The ground seemed to want to swallow him, draining his strength. Behind, the roar of the landslide grew louder and louder, mixing with the sound of trees being uprooted and gigantic boulders rolling like toys. He needed to look to know. The danger was getting closer. Instinct screamed for him to continue, but Billy's body was exhausted, weak from hunger, cold. Still he ran. I was running for something I couldn't even name. Maybe it was the desire to live. Maybe it was the memory of his mother, Luna, in some corner of his heart not to give up. Whatever it was, it kept him moving, even when his legs shook and he lacked air. But fate is relentless. A trunk, carried by the force of the mud, appeared out of nowhere. Billy tried to avoid it, but slipped, falling on his side. Before he could get up, flood of mud, rocks and debris overtook him. The impact was brutal. The mud was heavy, dense, cold. Billy felt his body being dragged, hitting pieces, wood, branches, rubble. The world spun in a whirlwind of darkness and despair. He struggled to keep his head above the mud, to breathe. Each attempt was frustrated. The weight of the earth pulled him down as his lungs burned, begging for air. There was a moment, a brief instant, when world seemed to stop. Trapped under a mixture of mud and debris, Billy could no longer fight. Fatigue won. The fear gave way to a strange sense of surrender. His eyes, half closed, glimpsed what seemed to be a distant, diffuse light, perhaps a reflection the moon behind the dense clouds, and for a second he thought he would see Luna again, but fate, once again, had other plans. Buried, Billy's heart was still beating, weak but resistant, because sometimes life clings to the smallest fragments of hope, and Billy, even without it, still had a story to live. Have you ever thought about how in the midst of the most absolute chaos, a barely perceptible sound can everything? Amid the heavy silence of a tragedy, where the air seems stagnant and every second is a reminder of loss, a whisper, a fragile groan, can be the thread of hope capable of changing the destiny of a life. That's exactly how Billy's rescue began, with a sound small that, had it not been for a listening heart, it would have been swallowed by the void of the day had dawned full of grey, with the sky still weeping from the previous night's storm. The air was with humidity and dust, and the smell of wet earth mingled with that of broken wood and broken concrete. The scene was desolate, destroyed buried streets and a strange silence, broken only by the sound of heavy machinery digging and the muffled voices of who moved with haste, but also with painful caution. Every shovelful of removed could reveal a survivor, or something much more difficult to face. Miguel, one of the volunteers, was there from the early of the morning. His tired eyes hid sleepless nights, but his determination was unshakable. It wasn't the first time he'd in a rescue, but the weight of responsibility never seemed to lessen. With each operation, he carried not only but also hope, a hope that sometimes seemed too stubborn for the circumstances. But it was exactly this stubbornness that kept him digging, listening, waiting. As the noise of the excavators echoed, Miguel decided to move a little from the main search area. Something in his instinct guided him to a quieter corner, where the ground seemed too for the heavy machinery. The ground there was cracked, with debris piled up chaotically, as if the ground itself had swallowed everything. He knelt down, resting his ear against a concrete slab, partially covered in mud. It was then that he a faint sound, very weak, something between a moan and a whimper, almost imperceptible like the whisper of a timid wind. Held his breath, concentrating, to make sure it wasn't his mind playing a trick. But the sound was there, a small lament, muffled, desperate, but all vivo. Miguel's heart raced. He stood up quickly, calling for other volunteers, but his voice seemed to carry through a deaf world where everyone immersed in their own task. He knew he couldn't wait. Every second counted. With hands shaking with adrenaline, Miguel began to dig what he had, sometimes with the shovel, sometimes with his own hands, ignoring the cuts that the sharp rocks made on his fingers. Mud was thick, sticky, making every movement difficult, but he didn't stop. Gradually, other volunteers joined him, drawn by the urgency in his voice, formed a chain, passing buckets of dirt and debris, each carrying the silent hope of finding someone, anyone, who was still breathing beneath that sea mud. But for Miguel, there was something more. He couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the tone of that whimper, something that touched a part of the heart that words couldn't reach. As they dug, the sound became clearer, still faint. The pace of work intensified. Miguel was sweating even with the cold of the morning. His face was covered in mud and tears that he knew if they were from tiredness or emotion. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he saw a small open up in the wreckage, and there was Billy. The cub was covered in mud, almost unrecognizable, with only one eye half open and it shaking with weakness. The muzzle could barely move, and its whimper was a hoarse whisper, but still a cry of he was exhausted, suffocated, but vivo. Miguel reached out his hand carefully, as if touching something so fragile could break it. Fingers reached the cold little body, and in that touch something invisible was formed, a connection that didn't need words. It was as if Billy, in his tired little heart, that someone had finally seen him, heard him, felt him. The rescue was far from over. Getting Billy out there without causing more collapses would require precision and patience. But at that moment, Miguel knew that the most important had already happened. They had found him, and sometimes that's all a being needs, to have a new chance. Be found. You ever felt that moment when your heart beats so hard that it seems to echo in your ears? As if your body itself is trying to say, "This is for Miguel." That moment was exactly like that. The noise around him, the voices of the other, the metallic sound of tools, the distant echo of the machines, all dissolved into the air when he's finally met the gaze of Billy, the little cub buried in the mud, a weak look, erased, but with a silent plea that cut through the dust, fear, and fragility of the moment. "Please save me." Miguel knew what was at stake. He was unstable. Every movement could trigger a new landslide. The slightest mistake could cause tons of earth to collapse again, not only burying once and for all, but also putting his own life at risk. But at that moment, logic had no space. The fear was there, of course, beneath the skin, but there was something stronger. The inexplicable connection that is born when a helpless being trusts you to be their last hope. Hesitation. Miguel crawled through the wreckage, ignoring the ground that shook slightly under his weight. The space was tight, so narrow he could move his shoulders. He had to advance sideways, using his bare hands to dig small openings in the compacted mud. Every time he hit a piece of debris, the earth around him creaked ominously, reminding him of how precarious that roof of mud and debris above his head. The air there was stuffy, mixed with the strong smell of wet earth, and more subtle, a smell of fear, of life on the brink of death. The sound of Billy's faint breathing was imperceptible, but Miguel clung to it like a compass. "I'm coming, little one. Just hold on a little longer," whispered, even though he knew the puppy couldn't understand his words. But maybe on some deeper level, Billy. Because he was still there, fighting with that look that refused to close completely. Miguel finally reached Billy's small body, partially beneath a wooden slab and a heavy mixture of mud and rocks. The cub trembled slightly, a sign that there was still life, but time was them. Miguel knew he couldn't just pull it away. Any sudden movement could cause more debris to collapse. He needed to be careful, even when everything inside him screamed to act quickly. With one hand, he began to remove the mud from around Billy's small body, feeling the cold texture stick to his skin. The cub let out a weak moan, a mixture of pain and relief, as if he knew that help had finally arrived. Miguel felt a pang his chest, a pain that came not from a physical injury, but from a deeper place, that space in the heart that is only touched when are faced with the raw vulnerability of life. With every second, the air felt heavier. Sweat ran down Miguel's face, mixing with the dust and mud, but he didn't stop. His ached, his muscles trembled with effort and tension, but none of that mattered. What mattered was Billy, that little being fighting for his life, the only thing he still had, hope in his eyes. When Miguel finally managed to free the last piece of wood that Billy, he felt his heart speed up even more. The cub was free, weak, covered in mud. Book. With the utmost care, Miguel wrapped the small body in his hands, feeling how light it was, too light for a puppy of that age, a silent of how much he had suffered. The moment Miguel began to retreat, dragging himself out of the narrow hole, the ground shook again. A loud echoed above him. The slide was not over yet. The earth around them began to give way, small rocks falling like a warning rain. Miguel knew was no time to think. In an instinctive reflex, he used his own body to protect Billy, bending over him as he continued to move, crawling fast as he could. The weight of the earth began to press down on his back, and the feeling was suffocating. As if the world itself was trying to push him back into the darkness he was fighting to get out of. The air was thinner by the second, dense and laden fine dust that scratched his throat with each labored breath. Miguel felt his chest tighten, his heart beating so fast that it seemed echo in his ears, drowning out the noise of the sliding around him. Panic threatened to take over, whispering his mind that he couldn't do it, that the weight of the earth would win. But he couldn't afford to listen to that fear. Not now. He closed eyes for a brief moment, just to focus on the only thing that mattered: Billy. The puppy was weak in his arms, a small body trembling, in mud, and almost without strength, but still with a thread of life that Miguel refused to let go. Panic gripped his throat, but he fought it the same he fought the weight of the mud. "Just a little more, we're almost there," he murmured, repeating it like a mantra. Not whether he was speaking to Billy or himself. Maybe it was out of fear, trying to keep him at bay, suffocating under her determination. Every move a battle. The narrow space forced him to crawl with difficulty, using his elbows and knees to drag himself, while his body protested with pain. The air seemed heavier, and each breath came with effort, as if the environment itself wanted to take away the mud stuck to his clothes, pulling him down, while small rocks and twigs scratched his skin. Muffled sound of new cracks above him made the terror grow, but he continued. Just a little more. Suddenly, a beam of light broke through the in front of him. It was faint, filtered by the dust suspended in the air, but it was there. A glimmer of hope. Felt a new breath invade his lungs, an energy he didn't even know he still had. They were close, he heard voices. They were muffled, but they were calling his name, cries of encouragement that cut through the chaos. Outstretched hands appeared, eager fingers ready to pull them out the hell of mud and fear. With what little strength he had left, Miguel did what he knew was most important. He Billy first. His hands were shaking but steady enough to ensure the cub was reached by the volunteers. Felt the small body being pulled from his arms, and in that instant a wave of relief mixed with overwhelming fear hit him. What if it was too late? Heart beat wildly, not because of the danger itself, but because of the uncertainty about the fragile thread of life he had just given away. Only when was safe did Miguel allow the weight of exhaustion to overwhelm him. The strong hands of his colleagues grabbed him, pulling him out of the tight hole. The cool air hit his face like a slap of reality. He gasped, taking a deep breath, oxygen burning his throat, filling his lungs with brutal relief. The cloudy sky seemed brighter than ever. He was out. They were out. Miguel fell to knees on the sodden ground, his arms too heavy to support his own body. The tremor in his hands no longer came from physical effort, from the adrenaline that still coursed through his veins, mixed with the remnants of fear. The metallic taste of dust was still in his mouth, and muscle ached, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that Billy was there, vivo. Volunteers gathered around the little cub, quickly wrapping in a blanket to warm it. Billy's body was so light, so fragile, that he seemed to almost disappear between the folds of the fabric. Tried to offer water, small drops so as not to overwhelm him, while checking his weak and irregular breathing. Miguel watched everything, unable to away, as if his eyes were the only thing keeping Billy anchored to life. A solitary tear ran down Miguel's dirty face, tracing a clear path the dust and mud. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but the accumulation of everything he had felt in that suffocating space. The fear losing, the hope of saving, the relief of having succeeded. It was weight of a connection that had been born in the darkest silence between despair and hope, where two souls, one human and one animal, found common purpose: to survive. Michael continued to kneel, breathing deeply. As the sound of the world hymn slowly returned, the noise of the volunteers, the hum of the machines, the sound of the fine rain that was beginning to again. But to him, the only sound that mattered was the fragile but present sound of Billy's, a soft sound, but full of meaning. A sound that said, "I am here." And, at moment, Miguel realized that he was too. Not just physically, but present in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. And all this because of a puppy even covered in mud, and on the verge of death, carried within him the strength of a hope that Miguel didn't even know existed. Have you ever stopped to think about how scary and at the same time, full of hope starting over can be? No matter how difficult the path has been to get there sometimes, it is at the moment when everything seems broken, a new story begins. For Billy, the little pup who survived the landslide, the rescue was just the chapter. The real challenge was about to begin, the challenge of trusting again, of healing not only the body, but also the scars that fear and abandonment left. The shelter where Billy was taken was simple, but full of stories like his. Animals rescued from situations, each carrying their own battle. The room had the smell of disinfectant, mixed with the aroma of food and medicine. The sound of barking and meowing echoed through the hallways, some others anxious, but Billy remained silent. The cub was weak, its eyes still half dim, its thin body covered in small scratches and bruises. He dehydrated. His breathing was irregular, and every movement seemed to require immense effort. Veterinarians acted quickly. They applied serum to dehydration and began to clean his wounds with all the care in the world. Billy, even though he was scared, didn't resist. Maybe his strength was few, or maybe because deep down he knew that those hands were there to help, not to hurt. The delicate touch, the soft voice, the caregivers, were new sensations for him. No one had ever taken care of Billy like this. No one had ever looked at him with such, and even though he didn't fully understand what was happening, there was a subtle sparkle in his eyes, shy, imperceptible but present, the glow of hope. Meanwhile, Miguel, despite being exhausted and with some injuries from the rescue, couldn't stay away. Went to the shelter the next day, barely waiting for the sun to rise, and he came back the next day, and the next one too. Each visit was a step strengthening something that had already begun to form at that critical moment beneath the earth. A silent, powerful bond, the two. Miguel sat next to the small stall where Billy rested, without expecting anything in return. He just sat there silently, the puppy's space and time. Sometimes he spoke softly, talking about his own day as if Billy could understand, and somehow he understood. Not but the tone of the voice, the warmth of the presence, the feeling of no longer being alone. For the first few days, Billy could barely lift head, but his eyes always followed Miguel when he arrived. It was a suspicious look, yes, but also curious. Who was that man kept coming back, even when Billy was doing nothing but existing? Little by little, fear began to give way to familiarity. The puppy longer cowered as much when Miguel approached. There was a slight movement of the tail, almost imperceptible. Like a whisper of gratitude, he still didn't know how to fully express. The recovery process was not linear. There were days when Billy seemed to get with more energy, trying to get up on his own. But there were also relapses, moments when fatigue seemed than the will to fight. Miguel was there in all of them, sitting on the cold floor of the shelter, sometimes with his extended through the railing, allowing Billy to feel his presence even when the cub didn't have the strength to get closer. He didn't anything. It just offered what Billy needed most: patience, time, and a constant presence. As the weeks passed, Billy's body began to decay. His fur, previously dirty and matted, was now cleaner, beginning to gain a subtle shine. The wounds healed, leaving marks that told their story without words. But the most important thing was what happened inside. Billy's gaze, previously dull, now carried new. It wasn't just survival, it was life. Miguel knew there was something special there. It wasn't just a rescue. Billy had touched inside him, a space he didn't even know was empty. Perhaps it was a reflection of humanity itself, a reminder that, even broken, deserves a second chance. And Billy, that little warrior who defied death, was now learning what it meant to live. Not just exist, but live. And all this because someone had the courage to look at him and see more than a dirty, scared puppy. The road would still be long. There would be more days, more challenges. But for Billy and Miguel, the most important thing had already happened. They found each other. And that's all we need to start truly healing. Have you ever wondered how something fragile can transform into something extraordinary? How can a tiny grow into a strong tree, capable of withstanding winds and storms? The same happens with the heart. And for Billy, the little cub who once buried under mud and rubble, the transformation was just that, a rebirth. Time passed like a gentle breeze that, little by, healed the visible wounds, and more slowly the invisible ones. The fragile Billy, who trembled with fear at each louder sound, began to giving way to a new Billy, full of life, curiosity, and something he had never felt before: security. The puppy that had once looked at Miguel was now running towards him, with his tail wagging in pure joy, as if his own heart was swinging along with. The first time Billy actually shook his butt was a simple but meaningful moment. Miguel had arrived at the as he did every day, but that morning something was different. Instead of cowering in a corner of the stall, Billy ran, still somewhat clumsy steps but full of energy, to the railing, jumping excitedly, his tail wagging as if to say, "I know you, I trust." And Miguel, who had already faced the weight of Rubble and the fear of loss, felt his chest tighten with emotion for something so small and so at the same time. The days became lighter. Billy discovered the pleasure of running fear, of feeling the wind hit his face, of rolling on the grass without worrying about what might be hidden, a sudden movement. The shelter was still the same, but for Billy, the world had Miguel, and that made all the difference. Each visit was a festival of clumsy licking, uncoordinated jumping, and looks that said than words could express. The fear was still there in small reflections, but now it was overshadowed by bigger love. Miguel also changed. The man who went on that rescue mission to save lives found, without expecting it, ache of himself that he didn't even know was lost. He found himself smiling to himself when he remembered Billy's antics, his first firm steps, his attempts to bark at the other dogs in the shelter, as if he wanted to show the world that, despite being small, he was a warrior. And then the day that no one needed to announce. It was written in both of their eyes. Miguel entered the shelter as he did every day, but this time a different purpose. He wasn't just there to visit. He was there to take Billy home. It was not an act of charity, it was a reunion. It as if fate had just postponed the moment when they would become a family. On the way home, Billy looked out the car window, his ears pricked up and nose smelling the world outside. But this time he was not afraid. The world was still big, yes, but now he had a place in it. Was someone who would call him by name, who would care if he was okay, who would understand his looks and his silences. There was Miguel. And that's how the puppy that was once lost and broken became a symbol of something we all need, the certainty that, no matter how difficult path is, there is always the possibility of starting over. Billy not only survived the landslide, he survived abandonment and loneliness. And in the process, he showed that love has the power to transform, heal, and above all, give new meaning to life. Have you ever felt sometimes the past finds a way to catch up with us, even when we believe we have left everything behind? Not as a threatening, but as a silent reminder of who we were and how far we've come. For Billy, the little puppy who had been reborn from the ashes of and abandonment, this moment came unexpectedly, during a simple walk alongside Miguel. But it became much more than that. It was a peaceful afternoon, with the sun lightly gilding the horizon and a breeze carrying the smell of the city, mixed with the freshness of the freshly cut grass. Miguel walked Billy at his side, tethered by a light collar that he barely needed to wear. The bond between the two was so strong that the connection more mental than physical. Billy walked with his tail high, his ears perked up to the around him, exploring the world with the curiosity of someone who now knew he was safe. They passed through ordinary corners that were unfamiliar to Miguel, but that somehow seemed familiar to Billy. The puppy, now a young and full of dog, walked confidently until suddenly his steps slowed down. He stopped. The previously relaxed body became tense, and the curled back slightly. Billy looked around, sniffing the air carefully, and then turned to the ground. Focusing on a specific spot on the Miguel's heart sank, even though he didn't understand why. It was an ordinary place, apparently without anything, a narrow street, some weathered trees and an old rusty lamppost. But for Billy, that patch of ground was a portal to a he had never forgotten, only buried beneath layers of new memories. It was there that Luna, her mother, had her last breath. Billy approached slowly, his nose touching the ground as if he could smell something other than the smell of dust and earth. Watched in silence, respecting that sacred moment between the present and the past. He didn't say anything because he knew there were no right words, just waited with his heart sinking and his eyes moistened with the emotion of witnessing something so intimate. But something surprising happened. Was no crying, no sad moans. Billy didn't cower in fear or sadness. On the contrary, after a few seconds of sniffing the ground, he raised his head, looked directly at Miguel, and in that look there was no pain. There was no shadow of abandonment or the darkness of loss. What saw was different. It was a serene glow, a peaceful light that seemed to say, "I survived. I'm fine." It was as if Billy was saying goodbye to a he had carried for a long time without realizing it. The scars were there, of course. Invisible, the fur, but present in his story. However, they no longer hurt. They had become marks of overcoming, silent reminders of everything he had. The past couldn't be erased, but it also no longer needed to define who he was. Miguel knelt down next to Billy, running his hand over his head. No words were spoken because the silence was enough. They were there, two survivors of different battles, but by something greater than time itself. Miguel smiled, a soft smile full of pride, not just for Billy, but for the path they both walked together. Wagged his tail, not with the euphoria of an excited puppy, but with the lightness of someone who had found peace. They got up and continued walking, behind not only a physical place, but also a chapter that was now complete. Billy's past would always be a part of him, just like his scars, but that he showed that although memories can accompany us, they don't have to hold us back, because what really matters is not where we start, but far we can get. And Billy had come far, more than he could have imagined, more than fate seemed to have in store for him. He was no longer the lost, he was Billy, the survivor, the beloved, the dog who found a second chance to earn a family. Stories like Billy's remind us even in the most difficult times, there is always a chance to start over. If this journey touched your heart in some, if it made you reflect on strength, hope, and the power of second chances, You can be part of this current inspiration. Your like and yours enrollment help bring these stories to more people who also need to feel this now. I want to hear from you. Comment on the word down here. It represents everything Billy experienced, and maybe even something you felt during the "and" if you've been moved so far. What comes next will you even more? The next video is already on the screen, and it brings a story that will touch your heart even more. Because some don't end, they just transform.